No, come up. Can I ask the speakers to come up? We'll get started in a minute if people could settle down. I think most of you will know that I'm Peter Gluckman, President of the International Science Council, former Chief Science Advisor to 3 Prime Ministers of New Zealand. And it's my pleasure to run this session, moderate this session, which is going to take a slightly different angle to the issues of policy for science. Most scientists, when they think about policy for science, look at it through the lens of the scientist. What do we want the policymakers to do? Which is generally give us more money to do more research. I think most people think the major issue in policy for science is about giving more money to the competitive funding system. But we're going to take a different lens. We're going to take it through the lens of what the policymaker thinks should happen about the science system. Because that lens is very important, because ultimately, when policymakers are making decisions, they've got a different set of value propositions to take into account than we just simply do as scientists. Governments, whatever they're deciding to have limited tools. They have the tools of regulation or law, and they have the tools of budget allocation. And when they're looking at anything to do with science and innovation, they have to think about both the benefits that might come from the decisions they make about investment or the risks that might come from it. So in this past session, we're going to think about how the policymaker looks at science and how the policymaker then thinks about the value proposition of doing things in science. They have to think about, is it an essential investment? Is it a discretionary investment? Is it for the short term? Is it for the long term? And there's always a bias in politics for the short term for obvious reasons. Most issues in science policy should effectively be non-partisan because science transcends political cycles. But that's not exactly how it plays out in reality. And so we have to think about that as well. And when we think about the balance between risk and opportunity, just think about how genetic modification was dealt with across different countries. 20 years ago, some countries saw the benefits in one way and they promoted innovation and relatively limited control. Other countries saw it through the lens of precaution, driven by public opinion often, and put on controls which in many cases are still in place because it's become politically very difficult to remove constraints once they're in place. Contrast that with the situation we now find with artificial intelligence, where in fact the benefits or the perceived benefits of AI have led to a relatively uncontrolled development of AI, and now we're seeing an increased discussion about what are the downsides, and already it may be too difficult to actually regulate it. We as scientists all think about science policy through a relatively traditional lens, whether we use the language of the past year's quadrant, basic research, use-inspired basic research, pure applied research, and so forth, or more commonly, basic research, applied research development. But that's not actually how governments usually think about science. They think about it in a somewhat different framing. There are different ways you can consider it, but in my work and working with the New Zealand government, I usually talk about 4 classes of research. And they all have different drivers, and they all have different mechanisms needed to decide on support, and they also have different risk-benefit profiles. The first, which we don't think about enough, I don't think, is stewardship. The first role of a government is to protect its assets, whether they're the national identity, whether it's the economic, the human, the environmental, the cultural, the social assets of a country. And research plays so many roles in that, from the basic data collection on environmental standards to defensive research, military research, security research, cybersecurity research, and everything in between. And in fact, in many countries, that's the largest bucket of research that's actually funded by governments, even though it doesn't go through the processes that we normally think about. The second class of research is policy development, research to help governments make better policies. In New Zealand, where I come from, a good example of that would be the large support the government gives to research to reduce methane production from cattle, because methane production represents 50% of our emissions, and New Zealand faces an enormous economic cost in meeting its NDCs by purchasing carbon credits on the market if it can't reduce its carbon costs. It's an enormous future burden on the economy in many billions of dollars. Equally, another form of public policy research is operational research for the health system, the education system, the social welfare system, the justice system, and so forth. And again, that's research has different needs, different purposes. The third class of research is the class of research you're all familiar with. Research to produce new knowledge. And that's perhaps 20% of a government's overall investment in R&D when you take it through and a complete understanding of the decisions that make. And there are different decisions that are made in that area. How much you're going to spend on energy research, how much you're going to spend in health research and so forth, how much you're going to spend in pure discovery research, such as in cosmology and so forth. Governments have to weigh that up against those other criteria. And the fourth is the other well-known, which is to support economic development. That may be done through grants, it may be done through R&D tax credits. There are lots of ways it's done, but ultimately it's still a cost and seen by governments as part of them supporting the research and scientific endeavour. So today we've got speakers who are going to look at this question in different ways. 3 of them have deep experience in this public policy space, either as ministers or as senior advisors to governments in it. And our 4th speaker will also think about the ultimate defence mechanism, namely how do governments work together to avoid existential risk. The speakers are, as listed in the program, although we're going to change the order. The first speaker will be Asad Ramzanali, who is Special Assistant to President Biden, Chief of Staff and Deputy Director for Strategy in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and is a former well-experienced policy advisor to members of the US Congress. So he has a deep experience in thinking through these high-level issues of across policy of how to make decisions and recommend to governments at the highest level how to balance up investment, risk-reward balances and so forth. The second is Vahan Agbiapan, a civil engineer, former president of the leading university of Brazil, the University of Sao Paulo, and now now Secretary of State for Science, Technology and Innovation in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. So again, a lot of experience at the science policy interface and looking at this through the lens of policymakers. Thirdly, Daniel Filmus, twice Minister of Science and Technology in Argentina, and now Director of the Ibero-American Center for Research in Science, Technology and Innovation, placed in Buenos Aires. And the fourth is one of the ISC's fellows. We are proud that we have a number of relatively young fellows as members of the International Science Council Fellowship, Clarissa Rios, and she is a former member of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk in Cambridge and is now taking on a very important role, which she will discuss, in the Office of Disarmament of the United Nations, based in Geneva. So we have 4 speakers. I've each asked them to speak for about 6 or 7 minutes. One of our speakers will use an interpreter, at least when it comes to the discussion place, to help, because his first language is not English. And then after they've each spoken, we'll have a bit of discussion. I want to open up to the audience as soon as we can so we can have a vibrant participatory discussion. And I'm going to aim to finish about 5 to 7. I've been assured the buses will wait at the Marriott for long enough to us get our coats and get to the event later in the evening. So, but we won't drag ourselves on beyond 5 minutes to 7. So I'm going to ask Assad to open the batting, to use a English expression which is known to those of us who play cricket or love cricket. It may be not so familiar to Assad, but it's the person who's going to open the discussion up properly. So Assad.
I appreciate it, and thank you for setting up that we're standing between people and dinner and cocktails. But thank you for that great setup. I appreciated everything you had to say, especially your categorization of what are the different types of support that government has and reasons for doing it for research. I want to talk about 2 things. First, as Peter mentioned, I'm an advisor for President Biden on science and tech matters. And the couple things I want to point out with respect to research and development is what he got done. So in his term, the R&D budget went up 25%. So the amount that the US federal government spends on R&D from 161 billion to 200 billion. And I'll talk a little bit about how that looks because it is a complicated story. But before I go there, I also want to say, importantly, he has also done a lot to think about how that money is spent. So under his watch, we created a new agency, ARPA-H. So many of you may have heard of DARPA, which is the Department of Defense research agency that we have. This is the similar model as DARPA, which is high risk, high reward research that cuts across universities and companies and many other actors, but applying that to healthcare. And so that's been really great to see it stand up, get its sea legs, make its first few investments, and it's really exciting what's happening there. And the second way we've started to change how the research funding happens is as part of the National Science Foundation, the first new directorate in, I believe, nearly 3 decades is the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, which operates differently than the other directorates that the National Science Foundation has, in that it works with tech companies. It operates in not just grants to university researchers, but does a whole host of other types of things, like encouraging regional innovation within the US, picking specific regions and helping encourage innovation that's not basic research, which is what a lot of the NSF's model is, but is thinking specifically about how that turns into, in your 4th bucket, economic development, how it turns into jobs. So that's been a new model, and it's been working fantastically, and we're really proud of that. To your point about the complication about how policymakers think about science, and let's just narrow in on R&D funding for a second. In our context in the US, that $200 billion is spread across over a dozen agencies. So about half of that is our Department of Defense, which does R&D very differently than the National Science Foundation. Our Department of Energy is a big player in that $200 billion as well, and they operate in many different ways, but the national lab system we have, they fund the national labs. Our National Institutes of Health operates differently, where they not only fund universities, but they have their own scientists in-house on campus as well. And so I tell you all of that to think about when we sit and try to move the ball forward on sometimes just the narrow question on can we get a little bit more out of the process for science and technology, for R&D. It is a balancing act, but it's not just us sitting in a room drawing up numbers in a spreadsheet. We work with the House and Senate, and in our system, we have committees and subcommittees, and R&D is not in one subcommittee. It sits across many of them. So you're working with so many different interests just in government who are, they're being talked to by not only their constituents and the universities that they represent, but also civil society, also scientists in universities. They're hearing from everybody. So it is a loud and complicated situation. And so it's not a simple, can we just increase the number? There are trade-offs, and it is important that we continue to think about where the money goes, how it goes, but in our view, it is important that we continue to invest a major part of our budget in research and development. The way I think of that is R&D, and the amount you invest in R&D is a signifier of how much you believe in your future, because the fruits of R&D are not today. They are in the future. They're beyond the political life cycle. And so to us, that's really important. I want to end with a little bit of a story on why public investment in every stage of the R&D life cycle matters, and that's mRNA. Many of us are protected by the mRNA vaccine, many of us in this room. That starts with decades of investment in basic research across chemistry and biology and so many different domains in many different countries. There's a Hungarian-American woman, Dr. Kariko, who who's recognized by the Nobel Committee last year for her work in this. She writes a couple of really important papers with one of her partners. After that, many years later, a couple of agencies, DARPA and the National Institutes of Health within the US context, invest in operationalizing that and thinking about what that means for infectious disease. Because at the time, a little company called Moderna was using this, and they were thinking about investing in just cancer. And my current boss, Dr. Arthi Prabhakar, who was the head of DARPA at the time, gave the green light to her program manager to say, let's give them some money to think about infectious disease. The payout for that doesn't happen for well over a decade. But the pandemic happens, and we have the science and the technology ready after many decades of investment, and millions of lives are saved. Now, that also doesn't happen quickly or easily or, in my view, enough. That takes a lot of investment to get shots into arms. It takes a lot of people communicating on why that's important. And sometimes we failed at that. Sometimes we didn't do as well as we could have. But on the whole, to me, that's an uplifting story of why we invest in this kind of science and technology over a long life cycle. So I'll end there, but thank you for kicking this off, and thank you all for being here.
We'll go through each of the four speakers panelists before we turn to a discussion. But I'm going to leave Assad with a question to reflect upon. You come from one of the world's superpowers of science. I mean, nobody would doubt the enormous depth of investment in R&D across all the spectrum. Many of the people in this room come from less developed countries or countries which have not got a strong history of investment in science for a variety of reasons, their developmental state, their political state, etc., etc. But America is also a country that does think about the world. I'd like to just leave you to think about what lessons are there from your experience that would play into a country that is less developed, not got a strong history of Vannevar Bush and all that followed from that in leading. So I'll just leave you to reflect on that. And I'll turn now to Daniel and ask Daniel if he would like to make his comments. Daniel?
I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in the World Science Forum. I congratulate the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, UNESCO, and the International Council of Science and the American Association of the Advancement of Science for organizing this event. First of all, it is necessary to emphasize the enormous difference that exists between developing and developed countries in the capacity to use the science to prevent, mitigate, and evaluate the negative consequences of risk. Resources available for the essential task are extremely unequal. I come from a region, Latin America, where investment in science and technology is considerably lower than in most countries of the North. The global distribution of resources destined to scientific and technological research shows that more than 95% of the investment is concentrated in the countries of the North. Latin America and the Caribbean represent barely 3% and Africa less than 2%. Regrettably, the evolution of investment in the last decade shows that inequality gap is increasingly widening. In a context of scarce resources, scientists face a double challenge. On the one hand, we must firmly defend before those responsible for political decision-making to need to invest in research with regard to immediate and potential risk. This is not an easy task. When urgent challenges such as poverty and demands of health and education remain unresolved for the large part of our population. On the other hand, we must be able to demonstrate efficiency and transparency why investment in these issues can avoid not only great suffering for our citizens, but also much greater expenditures for the future. In countries which generally like state policies that transcend different governments, scientific must contribute to carrying out political decisions that allow investment in short term with the aim of avoiding future risks. As Minister of Science and Technology of my country, I have been able to assess the favorable public opinion toward investment in science is essential to guarantee public resources for research. This requires making great effort in citizen education regarding need for scientific research to prevent, avoid risk, and improve the living and working conditions of our population. It is also necessary to counter with the arguments specific to science against the obscurantism and anti-scientific ideas that have recently occupied an important place in the public arena through fake news and disinformation on social networks. In modern democracies, developing the capacity to make knowledge accessible, understandable, and replicable for the majority of the population is as important as producing it. The role of open science and the educational system is fundamental to this task. At this point, I think it's pertinent to bring up the experience the humanity went through when it was shocked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries with greater resources were better able to confront it and invest enormously in finding strategies to defeat it. Countries lacking substantial material and human resources were subject to decisions of those who monopolized access to the technologies needed to detect the virus and produce the vaccine essential for combating it. Argentina and many other countries learned many lessons for this process. With a strong tradition in research in nanotechnology and biotechnology, Argentina was able to quickly produce its own mask, diagnostic kits, and more recently, a COVID-19 vaccine. This knowledge is now being effectively applied to prevent other health-related risks, such as potential dengue pandemic and endemic trend in the region. Moreover, if it is necessary to take into account that countries in the South are mainly producer and exporter of primary products. Many of our scientific research priorities to address serious risks. For example, those arising from climate change, are related to the need to ensure the improvements and productivity do not affect the sustainability of resources. In the same vein, scientific research is essential to prevent the necessary introduction of AI from future deteriorating the employment opportunities of our population. In countries with fewer resources and more poverty, it's very difficult to manage this dilemma between what is urgent, including the possibility of an immediate negative social impact in the deterioration of the living condition of the population, potentially affected by the results of the research and the economic and social reward that occur in the medium and the long term. Despite this difficulty, I would like to take advantage of my presence in this forum to firmly defend the idea that is essential for developing countries to greatly increase their investment in science and technology, including basic research. Our countries cannot overcome the poverty and underdevelopment they face today without the contribution of the science. Without it, they will remain trapped in the cycle of the bright dream, forcing many of our brightest young people to pursue scientific career abroad in countries of the North. I would like to end my speech by emphasizing that today, more than ever, cooperation between countries is essential to contribute through science to solution the challenge facing humanity. If the risks and problems are increasing global, the solution must also be global. It's not just a question of cooperation from the North that contribute to the development of science in the countries of the South. It is also a question of cooperation that must be understood as a strategy of self-defense by the most developed countries. Challenges concerning environment, health, food, energy, demography, migration, as well those related to oceanic and Antarctic ecosystem, for example, present global risk. Even this threat primarily occur in the South, if they are not addressed and solved through scientific knowledge, they will also lead to a deterioration of living conditions in the North. North-South cooperation is not an option. It is an imperative for the sustainable future of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think one of the questions you might be of interest to the audience is, there's a very mixed pattern of investment in R&D as a percentage of total expenditure by governments, particularly in low and middle income countries. So we've seen countries that are middle income but are still very low investors in R&D, and relatively few that have made a significant investment. Be interested in the arguments that you would use with your colleagues to argue for why in a low or middle income country the relative proportion of the government expenditure should include a greater commitment to science. Now, and what arguments do you feel are successful and what arguments fail in that context? You've been a cabinet minister, so I'll ask you to reflect on that and we'll come back to that later. And now I'd like to turn to Vahan to talk about his perspectives coming from Brazil, another middle-income country which is growing rapidly in its commitment to R&D.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the organizers for this invitation. It's very nice to talk with you. Well, let's talk about the risks. First of all, I do not agree with the term risk, because when we invest on science, usually you get the result. Sometimes the results are not as good as we wanted. Sometimes they are less than our expectation, but there are results. At least we train some young researchers to make a better research. So always we have some let's say, some some results. This morning, a lady, she said a very good statement. If it hasn't worked, it doesn't mean it was a bad idea. So we can change a little bit the term risk to, let's say, to how we can invest, as a government, invest better for development of science. But some risks are actually produced by the government itself. Some of the risk is the behavior of the government policies that make the research more difficult. For instance, regulation. Those who work with human beings, let's say with something with life, have difficulties. In my country, for instance, sometimes it's impossible. You have to stop your research because the regulations do not allow. Then you have the commercial barriers, which is very important. Sometimes what you are developing is not acceptable because of the commercial barriers. The financial support. Change the government, then the new government said, okay, this is not my interest. Sometimes you have already spent $10 million US, and you need to spend another $1 or $2 million, and you have to stop. I'm dealing with this problem nowadays. And you have market troubles, you have unfriendly innovation environment. You have the idea, the results are okay, but you cannot put the results you cannot to put the results in a practice. So the government is also a major cause of the risks. Of course, you have ethical problems, you have a lot of things going on. So in my point of view, risk is you are getting lesser return for the money that the government invested. So that is our major challenge, how to get the most with the money we are investing. Not in Brazil, but at least in São Paulo, we have autonomous institutions. So we can be sure that we have enough, let's say not enough money, but the money will be regarding with the economy of the state. So that's why we can plan a long time proposals. And another term that I'm very much concerned is that innovation is not restricted to make money with your research. Innovation, I prefer innovation as the way you translate the research results to the society. Sometimes making money, sometimes not making money. But translating the results do not stay in the academy, at the university. The results became public. And as I have also, my life was at the university, I know that we have sometimes in the research, dark sides, downturn, unintended effects of the research you are doing. So we do not like to show, but these difficulties or this risk we can solve inside the research groups. Well, so if you want good public policies, of course we have to these policies based in evidence. And to do so, we need to have more proactive researchers. Research work does not end when the scientists or the group of scientists published a paper or deposits a patent. The work must be considered finished when a proposal for public policy is presented. If you hand a report what 500 pages or 300 pages, the politicians cannot understand how they can use it. So it's very important when we finish our research work, we prepare a tentative public policy. That is our major task. As the time is running, but just to give some ideas of how to mitigate these risks, how to improve the research results. First of all, is to make it stronger the scientific entities. Autonomy of the universities is of utmost importance to get better research. Autonomy of the financial research supporting agencies is fundamental. That is the secret of the state of São Paulo inside Brazil. We keep our state universities are autonomous financially and administratively, and the research supporting agency is also autonomous financial and administrative point of view. The second point is the leaders of the research must be more proactive behavior. They must be more understanding what's going on with the society. If you think about risks, we know how to manage risks. I'm an engineer. I spent several years in the engineering school learning how to control the risk of the engineering design and so on. So we have the tools, but we do not apply these tools that we know very well for the research works. So we know how to do the research, the risk management. It's just to make this approach usual on the research work. Of course, it won't be possible to have all of the researchers expert in risk management. That's why it's very important for the research institutions, research supporting institutions at the universities and research institutions, all of them have a compliance to work with this approach. And of course, transparency. When you have transparency, you can see what's going on, you can see how much you are spending in some research and how is going the results. These are some ideas, then later we can discuss better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last panelist is Clarissa, who is going to bring together a different perspective on risk, given her background in studying existential risk, and one in particular that she's now working on for the United Nations. Clarissa?
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here. Colleagues, I'm turning 40 years old very soon. So when I tell my friends, close friends, so my generation, that I work on the field of existential risk, they are very happy because they think that I'm going to fix their middle-age existential crisis. So then I have to explain that by what I mean by existential risks are events that can decimate humanity to a point where there is no point of return. So the number of humans that will be left because of these events will be so little that society cannot be rebuilt in the way that we know it. So there are different types of events that can trigger this existential event, and one of them is very linked to biorisks. And if we go to more specific terms, then the term of bioweapons will be the one that will come up to the stage. Bioweapons could be viruses that have been engineered in a lab, changing the genetic code with the sole purpose to use them as a weapon of war, as a weapon of terror. So I wonder, who do you think is in charge to prevent these bioweapons? I wonder how many of you have heard or know about the Biological Weapon Convention before today. Can you raise your hands? Good, I think 50%. So that's, for me, that's really great. So the Biological Weapon Convention is an instrument that we have within the Office of Disarmament that was carved thanks to multilateralism, thanks to diplomacy in the late 60s, and then it entered into force in 1975. It's a convention that has been signed by 187 countries, which means that 10 countries are still out of the convention. And the convention is having meetings every year, around like 1 month of meetings at the United Nations. And when we think about the instruments that we have to prevent weapons of mass destruction, as you may know, nuclear, chemical, we have biological, these are within the group of weapons of mass destructions. Unfortunately, the Biological Weapon Convention is not very well developed, even though next year is going to be 50 years since it was created. When we compare it to the Convention for Chemical Weapons or the two organizations for preventing nuclear weapons, we can see just in the number of employees. For nuclear, we have around 3,000. For chemical weapons, we have around 500. And for the biological weapons, we have 4 staff. And of course, we do as much as we can with 4 staff, but also that means that we have much less budget, and that doesn't allow us to do all the different things that an organization of that level could do as setting global guidance for biosecurity. So now that we have experience in our lifetime endemics, pandemics, that has at least give us a hint of what could happen if we have a bioweapon. I'm not saying that we have been exposed to a bioweapon. What I'm saying is like we have had a hint of what can be happening at the level of economics, education, transport. So now at the level of security, now at the level if we are talking about a war, and this is happening in the middle of the war. So the levels of emergency and the levels of crisis are immediately increased. To that, now add that the development of artificial intelligence has gone exponential on the last 5 years, if it's not on the last 10 years. Before they were talking about developing AI tools, but now if you hear closely to what companies developing AI are saying, they are thinking about developing artificial general intelligence, which is to have an AI that can do exactly what humans can do, but with a computer power that we have now. So putting these two together, of course, countries are wondering, are our conventions on weapons of mass destruction that were signed and negotiated in the 70s, in the 90s, up to the task of this technological era? So within the Biological Weapon Convention, this is something that they are also thinking. And since 2 years ago, they decided to create a working group, which is it's what they do between the intersessional period. So for the Convention of Biological Weapons, you take decisions every 5 years. So right now, we are in the intersessional period. And then they came up with the idea of a working group to develop recommendations on how to strengthen the convention. So there are 7 topics that are being discussed. Among them, you have compliance and verification, which is a topic that in 2 decades have not been discussed because of blockage, because some countries don't want to touch upon that topic because they think that their national security could be exposed or because they don't want in-situ inspections and other reasons. But let me tell you that the convention in 2024 is in a very interesting place. Why? Because from these 7 topics, there are 2 that are very well advanced. And when I say very well advanced, I mean that consensus is being created because at the convention, all the decisions and changes happen by consensus. So 187 countries have to say yes to a proposal. And these two mechanisms that are being discussed right now and are very well advanced, one is the Science and Technology Advisory Mechanism, which will be to create a science advisory board for the convention so they can keep up to date with all the technological advances. And then the second one is the one of international cooperation and assistance, which is very focused on how can we use biotechnology as an instrument for peace. And here it comes all the projects that could be dealing with transfer of knowledge, transfer of equipment, transfer of reagents, improving infrastructure to be using biotechnology for peaceful purposes. So in December, in 2 weeks, all your countries, if they are signatories of the convention, are going to be getting together and are going to be deciding if these two mechanisms are going to be created or not. And of course, by saying they are going to be created, that means that they have to give budget to create the staff and to create all the requirements to put these two mechanisms into place. And to do that, they have to call a special conference, because otherwise they have to wait until 2027. Remember that I said that there are review conferences, so the next one is in 2027. But if they want to create change, they can call for a special conference next year. Now the question is, and I'm coming to the closing part, will this be enough, having these two mechanisms to secure biosecurity around the world? This is a question that I leave to you, but when I talk with some diplomats, some of them have the vision that perhaps an organization should be created for the biological weapon conventions as well. So then in that way, we can have an office for education, an office for verification, an office for legal assistance, an office for capacity building, and etc. So these are one of the things that I want to leave to you with that question. And because the topic of the World Science Forum is science and policy interfaces, I want to also ask you, so what do we do while the diplomats, your delegations to the United Nations are discussing these agreements? What can scientists, civilians can do? Let me tell you one thing that is happening now at the convention, and it is being developed thanks to the Geneva Science Policy Interface grant that the International Science Council has received. So basically, the International Science Council is now creating science policy interface for the convention. And they have a project that is 6 months, started in May, and then they had an open call for experts that can aid diplomats about different topics from the convention, and they created this expert group. This expert group has been meeting online with some of the diplomats that are tasked with developing recommendations on science and technology, international cooperation and assistance, and compliance and verification. After these online meetings happened, the expert group got a sense of what are the needs of the convention, and they have developed policy briefs. And these policy briefs, I'm very happy to let you know that are going to be disseminated ahead of the meetings in December. So the next week, those policy briefs should be going to all the delegations of the countries in the Biological Weapon Convention. Furthermore, this expert group is going to come to the convention, and it's going to be hosting a side event where they are going to be able to talk with the diplomats and engage in bidirectional conversation so their policy briefs can be improved, tailored to what can be done at the convention, and on the other hand, diplomats have the possibility to talk in a more close environment with scientists and the experts. So I think this is something that is very needed, because sometimes we think about science advice coming from one side, but it should come from both sides, in a collaboration, in a conversation, and understanding of even more stakeholders than just diplomats and scientists. So I want to finish by saying that we are ready to keep engaging in science and policy interfaces, and also happy to discuss more details about how it's happening. And congratulations to the International Science Council for that.
I've got a general question for a quick answer from each of you. A lot of this conference has been about trust in science and the fact that there's been a decline or perceived decline in trust in science. It's been politicized, there's disinformation, there is populism that's also impacting. there's a decline in trust in institutions as a whole, and that includes the institution of science. To what extent do you think that decline in trust, which is seen in the popular domain and the public domain, is going to influence the way that decisions are made by policymakers about investments in R&D? It seems to me there's a risk there that we've not really thought through. But I think that without asking a particular issue of a particular government, there's a danger that investment in science is becoming more of a political issue, particularly because of the links to disinformation and growing skepticism that belief in science or disbelief in science or lack of trust in science may become a badge of political identity. Now, Assad, do you want to comment on that question, or is it too sensitive for an American at this point in time?
The feelings are still a little bit raw, but look, I think you're getting at something important, and we do see the normal partisan fray that exists on cultural issues. That domain is expanding, and science is not at least in my view, has not been a purposeful target of it, but has been a byproduct of the expanding domain of partisan rancor and the fights that happen in culture wars. We've seen that happen recently with some of the work we've done just recently. And so that does happen. I do think it will have an impact. We haven't seen it yet on budgets for R&D. I fear it will.
Yes, I just recently co-chaired with the Joint Research Centre of the European Union a workshop on trust in science, and the fundamental conclusion of that was also that this is really a side effect of the expanded barriers of decline in trust in many ways in broader institutions, and science has got caught up in this broader issue than it being a specific issue about science. Daniel, do you want to comment?
Yes, I will speak in Spanish, and Gaspar will make the translation. So I apologize. Bueno, si tuviera que responder tu pregunta necesitaríamos varias horas.
So, well, if I had to respond to your question, I think we would need several hours for that.
Pero voy a mencionar 4 razones de por qué invertir en ciencia en los países de desarrollo medio o países relativamente pobres, y una de por qué no invertir en ciencia.
But I would tell you 4 reasons for why to invest in science in terms of low or medium income countries, and 1 argument against it.
El argumento que no debemos usar los científicos es que es bueno invertir en ciencia para los científicos.
1 argument that scientists should not use is that it's worth investing in science because of the scientists themselves.
Los 4 solo los voy a mencionar. El primero de ellos es que los países en vía de desarrollo tienen los investigadores con capacidad como para poder aportar a la ciencia universal, fundamentalmente la ciencia básica.
So 1 reason for would be that developing countries also have scientists who have the capacity to contribute to world science.
Por ejemplo, Argentina tiene 5 premios Nobel, 3 en ciencia básica.
And Argentina has 5 Nobel Prize winners and 3 of them in natural sciences.
La segunda cuestión que señalaría es que hay problemas que si no investiga cada país sobre sus propios problemas, no hay nadie que vaya a investigar.
The second reason would be if the country itself does not invest in certain matters, then nobody will.
Ciertas enfermedades, o en el caso argentino, temas oceánicos o antárticos, que si Argentina no investiga, no hay otro que investigue nuestros temas, y eso es la vida o la muerte para nuestra población.
So in fields, in domains such as illness, social issues, social questions, the matter of Antarctica, where there is also huge Argentine interest, these are all a question of life and death, also in terms of the population.
La tercera razón, muy breve, es que si no transformamos la matriz productiva, nuestros países son solo primarios y no tienen capacidad de dar trabajo para toda la población. Hace falta investigar, como el caso de Brasil, y generar con eso transformaciones productivas que nos permitan exportar productos que no sean solo productos primarios.
And the third reason is that if we do not transform primary production, primary knowledge, then we will only produce primary products. And as it also applies to Brazil, if we don't do anything like this, we don't generate any kind of productive transformation. We will only bring about primary products, nothing else.
Y la última es que los países en vías de desarrollo no tenemos inversión privada en ciencia. Casi toda la inversión es inversión pública.
And the fourth reason is that in the case of developing countries, there is basically no private investment in sciences, only public one.
Las grandes empresas investigan en sus casas matrices.
So the large companies investigate in the framework of their own mother companies.
Yo escucho lo que invierte Estados Unidos y me muero de envidia.
I heard the US numbers and I'm dying of envy.
Solo para concluir, quiero decir que no es una preocupación argentina que Argentina investigue. Recientemente hubo una carta de 68 premios Nobel dirigida al presidente argentino para que no abandone la investigación.
The worry that Argentina should invest in R&D is not only an Argentine worry solely. So 68 Nobel Prize winners, Nobel laureates, signed a public letter sent to the Argentine president urging him to invest in R&D.
I could say so did the International Science Council, write a letter at the request of the Argentinian science community. Rehan, do you want to comment on this issue of how trust in science impacts on how policy are made about investment in science by your political colleagues?
Yes. The major problem is science is not very well understood by the government. Not only in developing countries, including in the developed countries. So
Including New Zealand, but don't quote me.
Because it's something that is not very easy. They cannot, let's say, have the data to check everything. So it's very difficult for them to understand. That's why I always say the best thing is to have the autonomy, financial autonomy of the organizations, the research organization and the, let's say, agencies for the research support. That's the main point. And in our case, developing countries, the research is of most importance to really to change our economic situation for a better situation. For us, it's really extremely important because we have, as Daniel told, we have a lot of local problems that only we can solve them. That's our major problem. But I have just to add something for what Daniel said. We have good researchers in developing countries, and the cost of research in developing countries is cheaper than in developed countries. That's why, and it's my job, we try to attract foreign international companies to have their research, R&D offices, R&D labs in São Paulo. So if there's any company, you're welcome to open R&D centers in São Paulo, and we are succeeding because the cost of living is cheaper, not very much, but it's cheaper. The cost of the researchers, the cost of money you spend with the human resources is lower. That's why some large companies, they really realize that it's okay to have to open a new R&D center in São Paulo. And some of them, they succeed to have one company, they move from New York to São Paulo its research center.
Clarissa, we had the pandemic recently, but getting an agreement on an international pandemic treaty has been very, very difficult. Even changing the international health regulations, which are well outdated, have proved difficult. There definitely has been tensions over technology transfer, issues of global north, global south, technology transfer issues, issues over commercial interests. There's lots of issues behind it. And yet on something as fundamental, and given the recent experience of COVID, one would have thought that moving quickly on the international health regulations, moving quickly on a pandemic treaty would be possible, but it's proved not to be. It's been very slow and very weakened in the process. Given that, do you think that you'll make progress on the Biological Weapons Convention, that the interests will be sufficiently different, that because the previous issues around the CBW have been about global north, global south technology transfers? Do you think we're beyond that, or do you think that's still going to inhibit making real progress?
Yeah, I'm trying to be optimistic and see this year, 2024 and 2025, as very defining ones, also because of the things I mentioned, the development of technology and the exposure that we all had to endemics, pandemics. And I'm thinking that governments are noticing that a biological weapon will have no geographical barriers. It will just go, and we know how fast a virus can mutate and go from one person and one region to the other. So I think this is pressuring diplomats to think that it's an urgent matter. However, you will also have some diplomats that come and think that it's not a priority because, as crude as this sounds, but this is what they will say, there are other means to kill people. So they are seeing at drones, they are seeing at mines, they are still using it, although they have been banned, as a tool that can still be used. But I think that that perception comes also from the attachment to science and to the democratization of science in communications. I cannot imagine that at your dinner tables you are talking about artificial general intelligence risk, or about the next bioweapon that can come up. This is not popularized. And I think our colleague from Mexico in the morning also said, like, science is an alien term still. And that's part of the reason why we cannot build trust with citizens, but not also with citizens, also with diplomats. So I think that there is a lot to do, but I like to see this. I enjoy seeing how science diplomacy has moved since 2017, when I met you and you trained me, and I'm happy to see that these developments are happening from us, coming from the scientists. So congratulations to all the ones that are pushing for science diplomacy. I know how hard it is that universities don't recognize it sometimes. I know that you work many hours after your classes and your students and your PhD students. So please keep doing it, because it's moving and it's making the needle move as well at the UN level as well.
I'm conscious of time, but I think we take a couple of questions from the floor, and then we'll at the front here.
Well, it would be too easy for me to quote President Sarmiento when he inaugurated the Observatory of Cordova. But I would say that we are here, and the situation of the investment in science in Latin America continues to be the same as many years ago. The average of Latin America is 0.6%, 0.63% of the GNP, of which 1.3% is the percentage of Brazil, which determine the rest, because the median is 0.4. So I think that this is really the basic point, that one should attack this. And I would like to make a last comment concerning a comment made by the colleague from São Paulo. One of the prejudices in this moment is that very often people expect that research produces results. I would like to quote another very old thing. Emile Borel, the father of statistics, wrote an article not very well known in 1926, explaining that the investment in science must be examined on a statistical way, because one cannot expect that each project produces a result. And unfortunately, these are the prejudices which very often determine which project will be financed and which one will not.
I'll make a quick comment on that, but if you think about how some science is perceived as a failure, in the politics of the war on cancer of Nixon, it was initially presented as a failure. In fact, we would not have molecular biology, we would not have mRNAs, we would not have vaccines now had it not been for a failed war against cancer, which turned into a successful war against all sorts of biological problems 30 years later. So the time span is very important. I agree with your point about the linearity of individual experiments should not be considered. Questions at the back?
Yep, Thomas Barnhauser from Australia. This is a comment and a question to the Brazilian colleague. You mentioned that research is cheaper, you used that word, in Brazil, and it worries me a great deal. I think it's becoming very sharply capitalistic. You know, we try to make universities very cheap, research very cheap. I think, and because of that, you know, we're getting rid of senior staff at universities at an alarming rate. And this is the knowledge, and the experience, the characteristics, etc., what we're losing, which is not easy to get back. What is your comment on that kind of overly capitalistic view of research, you know, and not considering the fact that it's not like any other labor, which can be easily replaced?
Sorry, I was talking about the applied research that the companies, that the industry they produce. It's something different from the research of the university. The research done in the research centers, not directly apply, immediately apply. So there is a large difference. When you have of course, there are a lot of industries who do a very good basic science. So there are some very famous companies that are doing basic science, but I was mentioning the applied science, so something different. And for this point of view, if you have a good research group, good research environment, that's the main point, environment. So it's not only a group, an environment, you can really attract, and you have at least one part of the research supported. Usually when they are doing research, usually they support the basic research because they need the new results to have some changes. If you are working with companies who thinking not the immediate future, but thinking the long term, they also support basic research. These companies are already working in Brazil with their research development centers. They are doing basic research also. They are doing basic research. They are supporting basic research. Usually, they support the basic research with joint research with the university. Usually they support the university facilities, the university people, because they don't want to duplicate to build new labs in their premises. But you work together. So let's say, not doing be capitalist, but sharing the cost of the research with the industry is good for us. It's very important for us. Because he mentioned was Daniel mentioned that the cost of the research in the developing countries is only from the government. It's not only, but it's mainly from the government. So if you attract some private support, it's also very well. Very good.
I'm conscious of time, and I really think we do need to wrap up. I'm sure we could go for another hour, because I think the questions here are important. I think the important thing is we're trying to uncover here the arguments to be used by the community and talking to the policymaker and the policy community to get better results. I want to finish with an anecdote. A lot of discussion through this meeting has been about involving the public in influencing the policymakers about the importance of science. In 2013 or 14, the New Zealand government decided to ask the public what they thought were their priorities for major investment in research. And I chaired the committee that had to read the 50,000 submissions that came as to what was their priority. How many of you know the television or the film series Star Trek? The highest response, given New Zealand's isolation, what New Zealand wanted scientists to do was to invent the Star Trek transporter so people could move from New Zealand to England in 1 minute rather than the 36 hours it currently takes. I still wish we had worked out how to do that, but I don't think we're ever going to make that. But it's interesting how popular science, as seen through television, can influence the public's perception of what science can do. I think it also influences what policymakers think science can do. When I used to give lectures on evidence to policy and how to improve it, I pointed out the biggest source of evidence to most policymakers was their taxi driver, who told them what they thought should do. So thank you very much. It's now time to get on a bus and go to a concert. Thank you very much.